stimulate them to have them work better and form new connections. Okay. So why do we have these disorders? Why do we have this explosion of ADHD, dyslexia, learning disabilities? Why is it happening? Most of my patients will come in and ask me, why is it so prevalent? Why do I have it? And we know that there's several different components or several different reasons why this is occurring. We know that it's not purely genetic, okay? However, we know that there's different epigenetic things that actually create this type of problem. So epigenetics is the idea that our genetic tendency can be influenced by our environment, okay? So negative influences in the environment can actually make our genes more vulnerable to expression or adaptation. So they can either, formulate this problem, or they can not express it. So some of the things that have contributed to these disorders are the fact that our lifestyle has changed dramatically over the past 30 years, okay? Generally, we have a more sedentary lifestyle. We're exposed to environmental toxins, pesticides, hormones, in our food, antibiotics in our food, specifically with our meat and our protein foods. Also, we have a high amount of sugars. If you go to the grocery store and just even look at what you think would be a healthy food, for example, wheat bread, for example, if you look at it, generally the first thing it's going to say is high fructose corn syrup, right? Hydrogenated oils. All of those things are harmful to our cells and our body. And basically, those types of foods we've begun to eat those types of foods over the past 30 years. Our food chain has changed dramatically. Also, toxins in our foods, pesticides, synthetics, poor fats. Okay, all of these things are contributing to the health of not only the child but also the mother and the father. Obesity, sleep deprivation. Most people that I see in my office have some degree of sleep deprivation, and generally most of society does too. Chronic stress, chronic infections from yeast, bacteria, or parasites. That is one of the things I mentioned in the beginning with looking at someone from a functional standpoint in their blood work. A lot of times people can have underlying infections, parasites, and bacteria that they may not be aware of. And that's why we have to look at their blood work from a functional standpoint to actually determine if they're experiencing those things, because those create a chronic stressor to our body. And particularly if a mother is unaware that she may have hypoglycemia, or she may have parasites or a bacterial infection during pregnancy, along with some of the other things I mentioned, those can actually contribute to some of the causes. But again, there's multiple different things we're looking at here. Also, high frequency stimuli, the use of TV and computer games, stressful pregnancies and births. Generally, most of the children that I see have had some degree of either injury at birth, oxygen deprivation, or an illness that actually prevented their ability to move normally throughout their first year of life, generally. So, for example, if a child, say, has an injury to their arm, or they can't move, as an infant, or they can't turn themselves over, or they can't crawl appropriately for the period of time that they're supposed to do that, that can actually affect their ability to develop their neurological pathways. So, for example, that child that had an injury, say, to their arm, say they were unable to crawl for, at that period of time where they're supposed to crawl. Generally, they're supposed to crawl, for about 4 months. They're not supposed to go right into walking, because actually that crawling mechanism, really helps them dampen their primitive reflexes, which are their survival reflexes. So when we're born with, the startle reflex, we're born with a suckling reflex. We have all of these different survival-based reflexes in our first year of life. As we begin to move and as we begin to crawl, the children begin to crawl, they actually dampen those primitive reflexes, and they're able to form their higher neurological pathways. So that ability to move is so important, because that's when all of that takes place. Generally, a lot of the children that I see either had an illness or they had some sort of loss of ability to move in early childhood. And I often find that they still have those primitive reflexes. For example, the startle reflex. A lot of the children that are on the spectrum actually have these retained primitive reflexes. So we know that if they have those, there's no way that they can actually develop those proper neurological pathways in their brain. And particularly in the first 2 years of life, that's when the right hemisphere develops. So generally, if we see that, we know that we really have to work on that in order to really help them develop the right and left hemisphere appropriately. And we find that this is a big thing with the majority of the patients that we see. And we also find that these things are not being addressed or corrected, along with all the other areas that we just mentioned there. The interesting thing is we know that, the brain actually has the ability to develop pathways and form new connections if we give it the proper stimulus and nutritional environment. It has the ability to actually increase the strength of its connections, and it's actually malleable both physically and chemically throughout life. In the 70s or so, doctors said, that basically you're born with a brain, and this is how it's going to be for the rest of your life. You can't change it. Now we know that isn't true. We know that we can actually stimulate the brain, and the brain needs certain things in order to be stimulated. It's actually stimulated by movement. It's stimulated by oxygen, by all of our senses, our ability to see, hear, and smell, and also our balance system. So our environmental stimuli can alter our behavior and cognition by modifying connections between existing neurons and by neurogenesis. So if we give our brain good stimulus, for example, if we eat organic foods and healthy foods without pesticides and antibiotics, and also if we feed the child foods that they're not sensitive to, which we're going to talk about later, and we also stimulate their brain, we work on dampening those primitive reflexes, and we try to build that brain, we can create good neuroplasticity. However, if we are exposed to a bad stimulus, for example, lack of oxygenation, lack of movement, video games and TV, eating at McDonald's on a frequent basis, all of those things are going to create bad neuroplasticity. And that's really what we need to change. Through the Carrick Institute, generally what we do is we actually apply a certain stimuli to use our sensory and motor pathways of the body to stimulate the weak areas of the brain for improved outcomes. So generally, we'll assess the patient neurologically to find the weak areas of the brain. How am I going to check them neurologically? Okay. Generally, most of you are aware of what a neurologist would do. Generally, they would do some diagnostic test and evaluate someone. For example, say someone who has MS, they would evaluate their brain and they would determine if this person has a hard lesion. Well, a functional neurologist, or is what I do basically, is examined for those actually fine or those weak areas that actually you can assess by looking at the senses. So you can evaluate the eyes, the ears, their balance and vestibular system, their posture, their sensory pathways, their ability to move. If all of those different things are what I actually use to determine where they actually have a brain or hemispheric imbalance. Then I would actually